There's a mountain of stone standing on a plateau west of the Nile that has outlasted every empire that ever looked at it. 6 million tons of limestone and granite, stacked into a shape that rises nearly 500 feet into the desert sky, built from over 2 million blocks, some of them heavier than a loaded school bus. And here's the part that never stops being strange no matter how many times you hear it. The blocks are fitted together so tightly that in places you cannot slide a piece of paper into the seam. For almost 4,000 years, this single structure was the tallest thing human beings had ever built. Not until the Industrial Age did anything surpass it. So when a wave of videos started appearing online claiming that an artificial intelligence system called Grok had been fed the raw data of the Great Pyramid and had come back with an answer that shouldn't be possible, it caught fire. Millions of views. Thousands of comments arguing about lost civilizations and ancient aliens. But before we go any further, there is something you deserve to know upfront, because it changes how you should watch everything that follows. There is no verified scientific study, no published paper, no named research team that fed Grok a dataset on the pyramid and received the dramatic verdict these videos describe. What actually happened is something a little different, and honestly, a little more interesting once you understand it. People asked chatbots like Grok open-ended questions about the pyramids. The chatbot generated a plausible-sounding, dramatic-sounding response the way these systems are built to do, and that response got turned into a video script. That does not mean the underlying questions about the pyramid are fake. It means we need to separate the real, well-documented mysteries of Giza from the manufactured mystery of an AI declared this impossible. So that is exactly what we are going to do today. We are going to walk through what is actually measured, actually verified, and actually debated among the people who study this monument for a living, and we are going to be honest about which parts are solid ground and which parts are speculation dressed up as revelation. Let's start with the story most of us were taught, because it deserves to be laid out fairly before anyone starts poking holes in it. Around 2560 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, the pharaoh Khufu commissioned a tomb for himself on the Giza Plateau. Over roughly 2 decades, a large workforce, seasonal farmers who had nothing to do while the Nile flooded their fields, along with skilled permanent crews, quarried limestone locally and floated finer casing stone down the river from Chura, while enormous granite blocks came from Aswan, more than 500 miles to the south. They used copper tools, wooden sledges, rope, and an understanding of ramps and leverage that modern engineers have successfully reconstructed and tested. This is not a guess pulled from thin air. Archaeologists have excavated entire worker villages next to the pyramids, complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, and the skeletons of laborers who show signs of being well fed and cared for, some with healed broken bones that suggest they received treatment and continued working afterward. There are administrative papyri, including the Diary of Mayor, discovered in the early 2010s, which describes in day-by-day detail a crew transporting limestone by boat to Giza during the pyramid's construction. There are quarry marks, informal graffiti left by the work gangs naming themselves things like Friends of Khufu. None of this is disputed by serious researchers. People built this. Organized, skilled, motivated people, using tools appropriate to their era. That foundation is not in question. What is genuinely debated, and has been for a very long time, long before any chatbot entered the conversation, is not whether people built it, but exactly how certain specific technical feats were pulled off. And this is where the real intrigue lies, because some of these numbers are legitimately staggering. Consider the base of the pyramid. Before a single block went down, the ground had to be leveled, and the footprint in question covers about 13 acres. Surveys have found that this base is leveled to within a few centimeters across that entire span, an extraordinary achievement for any era, let alone one working without lasers or satellites. The leading explanation among Egyptologists involves cutting a grid of shallow trenches into the bedrock, flooding them with water so the surface naturally finds a level plane, marking that waterline against the rock, then draining the trenches and cutting the stone down to the marks. It is elegant because it uses a genuinely reliable physical principle. Water always finds level under gravity, and small-scale experiments have shown the technique works. Whether it explains every centimeter of precision across the entire base, or whether additional methods like sighting instruments and careful rechecking were layered on top, is a live question researchers still discuss. That is a real, open, interesting mystery. It does not require an AI, and it does not require abandoning the idea that Bronze Age Egyptians built this thing. Then there's the alignment. The four sides of the Great Pyramid are oriented to true north, south, east, and west with remarkable accuracy, typically cited as within about 3 to 4 arc minutes of true, a tiny fraction of a single degree. The standard explanation is astronomical. The builders likely tracked a circumpolar star as it rose and set, bisecting the angle between the two horizon points to establish a true north-south line, a technique that ancient astronomers across multiple cultures are known to have used and that has been tested and shown capable of producing this level of precision with careful, repeated observation over several nights. Some researchers have also proposed using the sun's shadow across a leveled surface throughout the day. Is it impressive that a civilization 4,500 years ago nailed cardinal alignment this tightly? Absolutely. Is it evidence of technology beyond their era? Not according to the archaeoastronomers who have actually run the numbers, because the techniques available to them, applied patiently and repeatedly, are sufficient to produce this result. The alignment is a genuine testament to careful, sustained observation of the sky. It does not require rewriting history. Now let's talk about the numbers that show up in almost every one of these viral AI videos, because this is where things start to slide from genuine open question into numerology, and it is worth understanding the difference. The most famous claim involves pi. If you take the perimeter of the pyramid's base and divide it by twice its height, you get a number very close to the mathematical constant pi. This has fascinated people for over a century. But mathematicians and historians of science have a well-supported explanation that does not require the Egyptians to have known pi as an abstract concept at all. If you lay out a base by rolling a drum or circular measuring tool of a certain height across the ground and counting rotations, a relationship resembling pi falls out of the geometry automatically, as a simple consequence of the tool, not because anyone understood or intended pi to be there. This is sometimes called the seek method, based on Egyptian units of slope that are tested in surviving mathematical papyri like the Rhind mathematical papyrus, which shows Egyptians absolutely did do sophisticated practical geometry, just expressed in their own units and methods, not in the language of Greek mathematics that would come 2,000 years later. The golden ratio claim, the idea that phi, approximately 1.618, appears repeatedly in the pyramid's proportions, is treated far more skeptically by mathematicians and Egyptologists than these videos let on. The core problem is one of statistics, not stonework. A pyramid has a base, a height, a slope, and a handful of diagonal and lateral measurements you can combine in dozens of ways, dividing this by that, adding this to that. When you have that many possible ratios to test against a single target number, you are almost guaranteed to find something close to it purely by chance, especially once you allow yourself to pick whichever combination lands nearest to the number you were hoping to find. Statisticians call this the look elsewhere effect, and mathematicians who have specifically studied the golden ratio claims at Giza, including detailed analyses published decades ago, have shown that the matches depend heavily on which specific pyramid, which specific measurement set, and how much rounding you allow yourself. Change any of those choices and the elegant relationship often evaporates. None of this means the pyramid's proportions aren't beautiful or that its builders weren't extraordinary mathematicians in their own right, using their own seek-based slope system. It means that finding a famous irrational number buried in a shape with this many measurable features is exactly what you would statistically expect to happen sometimes, whether or not anyone put it there on purpose. The Earth radius claim, the idea that multiplying the pyramid's height by a specific number like 43,200 gives you the Earth's polar radius, and doing the same to the perimeter gives you the equatorial circumference, is one of the oldest tropes in what's called pyramidology, a genre of speculative writing about the pyramids that dates back to the 1800s, long before any large language model existed. It gained popularity through amateur astronomer Charles Piazzi Smith in the Victorian era, who was convinced the pyramid encoded prophetic and cosmic measurements. Professional Egyptologists and historians of science have examined these claims repeatedly since then and have generally found that the fit depends on cherry-picking which unit of measurement to use, whether to measure to the base of the missing capstone or its reconstructed apex, and which of several possible scale factors to apply, and that with enough flexibility in your units and your rounding, you can make almost any building encode, almost any large-scale planetary figure. That is not a new insight from an AI. It's a century-old criticism of a century-old genre of pseudoscience, simply repackaged with Grok said so instead of a Victorian astronomer said so. Now, the tool marks and the construction precision are where things get genuinely fascinating. and genuinely unresolved in the sense that experimental archaeology is still actively working on it, not in the sense that no explanation exists. The casing stones that remain at the pyramid's base do show extraordinarily tight joints. And yes, this impresses modern stonemasons. Experimental archaeologists using only copper tools, wooden mallets, and abrasive sand, the toolkit Egypt is well documented to have had access to, have successfully reproduced tightly fitted stonework, though matching the very finest historical seams under real field conditions, heat, dust, human fatigue, remains difficult and is an active area of hands-on experimental study rather than a settled solved problem. The granite in the king's chamber, hauled from Aswan and cut with straight, confident lines through extremely hard stone, has long puzzled researchers about exactly which combination of techniques, copper source paired with quartz sand as an abrasive, along with stone-pounding tools called dolerite hammerstones that have actually been found at ancient quarry sites still bearing where marks consistent with pounding granite were used and in what sequence. This is real, ongoing experimental archaeology. Teams have successfully replicated granite cutting and drilling techniques using period-appropriate tools, copper tube drills charged with an abrasive slurry, for instance, producing spiral marks similar to those found in ancient boreholes. Is every single technique fully nailed down to universal scholarly consensus? No, and that is a completely normal state for archaeology to be in. Uncertainty about the precise sequence of an ancient manufacturing process is not the same thing as evidence of impossibility. The Sphinx erosion question is worth mentioning too, because it is one of the rare cases where a real, credentialed scientist has proposed something outside the mainstream, and it deserves to be represented accurately rather than folded into an AI narrative. Geologist Robert Schoch argued in the 1990s that the deep, rounded weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure's walls look more consistent with prolonged heavy rainfall than with wind and sand erosion, which would imply a construction date thousands of years earlier than the conventional 4th Dynasty timeline, since the last period of significantly wetter climate in that region was long before Khufu's reign. This is a legitimate, published, peer-reviewed hypothesis, and it remains a minority position. The majority of Egyptologists and geologists who have examined the same rock formations argue the weathering is better explained by the specific way this particular limestone erodes when exposed to wind-blown sand combined with occasional rain over thousands of years within the conventional timeline, and point out that no artifacts, tools, or settlement evidence from any hypothetical earlier civilization have ever been found on the plateau despite extensive excavation. This is a real scientific disagreement between real geologists. It is not evidence of a lost global civilization, and it is certainly not something any chatbot discovered. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a place that is honestly more interesting than aliens or lost super-civilization, because it is true. The Great Pyramid is a genuine marvel of Bronze Age engineering, built by a highly organized, well-fed, skilled workforce over roughly 2 decades, using techniques, water leveling, stellar alignment, copper and stone tools, ramps, sledges, and an economy sophisticated enough to feed and house tens of thousands of workers that archaeologists have documented, tested, and in many cases physically replicated. There are still real open questions about the exact sequence and combination of methods used for the very finest details, the tightest joints, the most demanding granite work, and answering those questions is active, ongoing work involving experimental archaeology, materials science, and careful re-examination of tool marks under modern imaging. What there is not, despite what a wave of AI-narrated YouTube videos will tell you, is a verified case of a research team feeding Grok a comprehensive dataset and receiving a bombshell conclusion that overturns Egyptology. What actually happened, in every case anyone has been able to trace, is someone typing a leading question into a chatbot and getting back a fluent, dramatic-sounding answer, because that is what these systems are built to produce: confident, well-structured language, not verified archaeological findings. A chatbot is not a research instrument. It has not run ground-penetrating radar over the plateau. It has not handled the tools. It is, at best, summarizing and remixing text that already exists on the internet, including, ironically, decades of pyramidology claims that were debunked long before any of these models were trained. None of this is meant to take the wonder out of the Great Pyramid, because it doesn't need artificial mystery to be one of the most remarkable things humans have ever built. Real history is not less interesting than the manufactured version. It is more interesting, because it involves real people, a river civilization figuring out how to move 80-ton blocks of granite 500 miles without a single wheelcat, tracking the stars precisely enough to lay out a building better aligned to true north than most modern houses, and organizing a logistics operation large enough to feed and house a small city of workers for 2 decades, all without any of it being magic, without any of it requiring a lost world, just human ingenuity, operating at the very edge of what their tools and their knowledge allowed. That is the actual story, and it holds up under scrutiny in a way that an AI declared it impossible never quite does once you go looking for the paper it supposedly came from. So if you want the honest version of this mystery, follow the archaeologists and the experimental builders who are still out there right now, testing copper saws against granite and rebuilding trial sections with period tools, because that is where the real answers and the real wonder actually live. If you found this useful, consider subscribing for more deep dives that separate the genuine mysteries of the ancient world from the manufactured ones, and let me know in the comments which part of the real story surprised you the most, the work of villagers, the star-based alignment, or the granite-cutting experiments, because that conversation is always worth having.